requires that a teacher be fully heard and more than that understood before he is judged. I should also add that sheer amount of effort is not an adequate criterion of docility. The reader must know how to judge a book, just as he must know how to arrive at an understanding of its contents. This third group of rules for reading is guide to the last stage in the disciplined exercise of docility. We have everywhere found a certain reciprocity. What's this? Reciprocity. Yeah, Recipro- reciprocity between the art of teaching and the art of being taught, between the skill of the author, which makes him a considerate writer, and the skill of the reader, which makes him handle a book considerately. We have seen how the same principles of grammar and logic underline rules of good writing as well as rules of good reading. The rules we have so far discussed concern the achievement of intelligibility on the part of the writer and the achievement of understanding of the part of the reader. This last set of rules goes beyond understanding to critical judgment. Here's where rhetoric comes in. There are, of course, many uses of rhetoric. We usually think of it in connection with orator or propagandist. But in its most general significance, rhetoric is involved in every situation in which communication takes place among men. If we are the talkers, we wish not only to be understood but to be agreed with in some sense. If our purpose in trying to communicate is serious, we wish to convince or persuade, more precisely to convince about theoretical matters and to persuade about matters that ultimately affect action or feeling. To be equally serious in receiving such communication, one must be not only a responsive but a responsible listener. You are responsive to the extent that you allow. One must be not only a responsive but responsible listener. You are responsive to the extent that you follow what has been said and not the intention which prompts it. But you also have the responsibility of taking a position. When you take it, it is yours, not the author's. To regard anyone except yourself as responsible for your judgment is to be a slave, not a free man. On the part of the speaker or writer, rhetoric skill is knowing how to convince or persuade. Since this is the ultimate end in view, all the other aspects of communication must serve it. Grammatical and logical skill in writing clearly and intelligibly has virtue in itself, but it's also a means to an end. Reciprocally, on the part of the reader or listener, rhetorical skill is knowing how to react to anyone who tries to convince or persuade us. Here too, grammatical and logical skill, which enables us to understand what is being said, prepares the way for a critical reaction. Thus, you can see how the three arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric cooperate in regulating the elaborate processes of writing and reading. Skill in the first two readings comes from a mastery of grammar and logic. Skill in the third depends on the remaining art. The rules of this third reading rest on the principles of rhetoric, convinced in the broadest sense we shall consider them as a code of etiquette to make the reader not only polite but effective in talking back. You probably also see what the first rule is going to be. It has been intimated several times already. It is simply that you must not begin to talk back until you have listened carefully and are sure you understand, not until you are honestly satisfied that you have accomplished the first two readings. Should you feel free to express yourself. When you have, you not only can just justifiably turn critic, but you should. This means that the third reading must always follow the other two in time. You have already seen how the first two readings interpretate interpenetrate each other. They are separate in time only for the beginner, and even he may have to combine them somewhat certainly. The expert reader can discover the contents of a book by analyzing the whole into its parts, and at the same time constructing the whole out of its elements of thought and knowledge. Its terms, propositions, and arguments, but the expert, no less than the beginner, must wait until he understands before he is justified in, in criticizing. Let me restate this first rule of critical reading in the following form. You must be able to say with reasonable certainty, I understand, before you can say any of the following things: I agree, or I disagree, or I suspend judgment. These three remarks exhaust all the critical positions you can take. I hope you have not made the error of supposing that to criticize is always to disagree. That is an unfortunate popular misconception. To agree is just as much an exercise of critical judgment on your part as to disagree. You can be just as wrong in agreeing as in disagreeing. To agree without understanding is insane. To disagree without understanding is impudent. Thought it may not be so obvious at first, suspending judgment is also an act of criticism. It is taking the position that something has not been shown. You are saying that you are not convinced or persuaded one way or the other. This rule seems to be such obvious common sense that you may wonder why I have bothered to state it so explicitly. I have two reasons. In the first place, many people make the error I mentioned above of identifying criticism and disagreement. In the second place, thought this rule seems obviously sound. My experience has been that few people observe it in practice. Like the golden rule, it elicits more lip service than intelligent obedience. I have had the experience shared by all authors of suffering book reviews by critics who did not feel obliged to do the first reading first. The critic too often thinks he does not have to be a reader as well as a judge. I also had the experience of lecturing both in the university and on the public platform. and of having critical questions asked which were not based on any understanding of what I had said. By a critical question here, I mean that rhetorical device by which someone in the audience tries to show the speaker up. And you may remember an occasion where someone said to a speaker in one breath or at most two, "I don't know what you mean, but I think you are wrong." I have, look, I don't know what you mean. Wait. I have gradually learned that there is no point in answering critics of this sort. The only polite thing to do is to ask them to state your position for you. The position they claim to be challenging if they cannot do it satisfactorily. If they cannot repeat what you have said in their own words, you know that they do not understand, and you are entirely justified in ignoring their criticism. They are irrelevant, as all criticism must be which is not so solidly based on understanding. When you find the rare person who shows that he understands what you are saying as well as you do, then you can delight in his agreement or be seriously disturbed by his dissent. In years of reading books with students, I have found this rule more honored in the breach than in the observance. Students who plainly do not know what the author is saying seem to have no hesitation in setting themselves up as his judges. They not only disagree with something they do not understand, but what's equally bad, they often agree to a position they cannot express intelligibly in their own way. Their, discuss- their discussion, like their reading, is all words, words, words. Where understanding is not present, affirmations and denials are equally meaningless and unintelligent. Nor, in, nor is a position of doubt or detachment of more intelligent in a reader who does not know what he is suspending judgment about. There are several further points to note concerning the observance of the first rule. If you are reading a great book, you ought to hesitate before you say, "I understand." The, pers- uh, per- the presumption certainly is that you have a lot of work to do before you can make that declaration honestly and with assurance. You must, of course, be a judge of yourself in this matter, and that makes the responsibility even more severe. To only to say "I don't understand" is, of course, a critical judgment, but only after you have tried your hardest does it reflect on the book rather than yourself. If you have done everything that can be expected of you and still do not understand it, it may be because the book is unintelligible. The presumption, however, is in favor of the book, especially if it be a great one. In reading great books, failure to understand is usually the reader's fault. Hence, he is obliged to stay with the task of the first two readings as long time before entering on the third. When you say "I don't understand," watch your tone of voice. Be sure it coincides the possibility that it may not be the author's fault. There are two other conditions under which the rule requires special care. If you are reading only part of a book, it's more difficult to be sure that you understand, and hence you should be more hesitant to criticize. And sometimes a book is related to other books by the same author and depends upon them for its full significance. In this situation, also you should be more circumspect about saying I understand, and slower to raise your critical lens. The best the best example of brashness in this last respect is furnished by literary critics who have agreed or disagreed with Aristotle's Poetics. without realizing that the main principle in Aristotle's analysis of poetry depends in part on points made in other of his works. His, treat, his treatises on psychology and logic and metaphysics, they are agreed or disagreed without understanding what is it all about. The same is true of other writers such as Plato and Kant, Adam Smith, and Karl Marx, who have not been able to say everything they thought or knew in a single work. Those who judge Kant's critic of pure reason without reading his critique of practical reason, or Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations without reading his theory of moral sentiments, or the Communist Manifesto without Karl Marx's Capital, are more likely than not to be agreeing or disagreeing with something they do not fully understand. The second general maxim of critical reading is as obvious as the first but needs explicit statement. Nevertheless, for the same reason, it is that there is no point of winning an argument if you know or suspect you are wrong. Practically, of course, it may get you ahead in the world for a short time, but honesty is a better policy in slightly longer run. As thus stated, I learned the maxim from Mr. Beardsley Rummel at the time he was dean of a social science division in Chicago. He formulated it in the light of many sad experiences both in his academic world and out. He has since become a leader in the mercantile world, and is he still finds it true that many people think a conversation is an occasion for personal aggrandizement. They think that winning the argument is what matters, not learning the truth. Oh my god. He who can regard this conversation as a battle can win only by being an antagonist, only by disagreeing successfully whether he is right or wrong. The reader who approaches a book in this spirit reads it only to find something he can disagree with, for the disputations and contentious a bone can always be found a pick on. It makes no difference whether the bone is really a chip off the other man's shoulder. What is sought is a cause belli, like incident in the Far East or Middle Europe. Now, in a conversation which a reader has with a book in the privacy of his own study, there is nothing to prevent the reader from winning the argument. He can dominate the situation. The author is not there to defend himself. If all he wants is the empty satisfaction of seeming to show the author up, he can get it readily. He scarcely has to read the book through to get it. Glancing at the first few pages will suffice, but if he realizes that the only profit in conversation with life or dead teachers is what one can learn from them, if he realizes that you win only by gaining knowledge, not by knocking the other fellow down, he may see the futility of mere contentiousness. I am not saying that a reader should not ultimately disagree and try to show where the author is wrong. I am saying only that he should be as prepared to agree as to disagree. Whichever he does should be motivated by one consideration alone, the facts and the truth about them. More than honesty is required here, it goes without saying that a reader should admit a point where he sees it, but he also should not feel whipped by having to agree with an author instead of dissenting. If he feels that way, he is chronically disputatious. In the light of this second maxim, I would advise him to go to a psychoanalyst before he tries to do much serious reading. The third maxim is closely related to the second. It states another condition prior to the understanding of criticism. It recommends that you regard disagreements as capable of being resolved, where the second maxim urged you not to disagree disputatiously. This one warns you against disagreeing hopelessly. One is hopeless about the fruitfulness of discussion if one does not recognize that all rational men can agree. Note that I said can agree. I did not say all rational men do agree. I am saying that even when they do not agree, they can. And the point I am trying to make is the disagreement is futile agitation unless it is undertaken with hope that it may lead to the resolution of an issue. These two facts, that men do disagree and can agree, arise from the complexity of human nature. Men are rational animals. Their rationality is the source of their power to agree. Their animality and the imperfections of their reason, which entails, is the cause of most of the disagreements that occur. There are creatures of passion and prejudice. The language they must use to communicate is an imperfect medium, clouded by emotion and colored by interest, as well as inadequately transparent for thought. Yet, to the extent that men are rational, these obstacles to their understanding one another can be overcome. The sort of disagreement which is only apparent resulting from misunderstanding is certainly curable. There is, of course, another sort of disagreement which is due to the inequalities of knowledge. The ignorant often foolishly disagree with the learned about matters exceeding their knowledge. The more learned, however, have a right to be critical of errors made by those who lack relevant knowledge. Disagreement of this sort can also be corrected. Inequality in knowledge is always curable by instruction. In other words, I am saying that all human disagreements can be resolved by the removal of misunderstanding or of ignorance. Both cures are always possible, though sometimes difficult. Hence, the man who at any stage of conversation disagrees should at least hope to reach agreement in the end. He should be as much prepared to have his own mind changed as seek to change the mind of another. He should always keep before him the possibility that he misunderstands or that he is ignorant of some point. No one who looks upon disagreement as an occasion for teaching another should forget that it's also an occasion for being taught. But terrible, but the ter- but the trouble is that many people regard disagreement as unrelated to either teaching or being taught. They think that everything is just a matter of opinion. I have mine, you have yours. Our right to our opinions is an inviolable as our right. Our right to our opinions is as inviolable as our right to private property. On such a view, communication cannot be profitable if, if the profit to be gained is an increase in knowledge. Conversation is hardly better than a ping pong game of opposing opinions. A game in which no one keeps score, no one wins, and everyone is satisfied because he ends up holding the same opinions he started with. I cannot take this view. I think that knowledge can be communicated and that discussion can result in learning. If knowledge, not opinion, is at stake, then either disagreement are apparent only to be removed by coming to terms and meeting of minds, or if they are real, then the genuine issue can always be resolved in the long run. Of course, by appealing to fact and reason, the maxim of rationality concerning disagreements is to be patient for the long run. I am saying, in short, that disagreements are arguable matters, and argument is both empty and vicious unless it is undertaken on the supposition that there are attainable truths which when attained by reason in the light of all relevant evidence resolves the original issues. How does this third maxim apply to the conversation between reader and author? It deals with the situation which the reader finds himself disagreeing with something like a book. It requires him first to be sure that the disagreement is not due to misunderstanding. Suppose that the reader has been careful to observe the rule that he must not begin a critical reading until he understands and therefore satisfies that there is no misunderstanding here. What then?